So today we are talking about making a great first impression as part of our Life After AmeriCorps topic. It's a lot of members who are getting ready to exit service right now, or maybe you've even joined us today after having exited service or completing your hours. If you are, congratulations. If it's still coming up for you, we're excited that you're in the home stretch and you're about to transition from being a member to being an alumni. That's such an exciting time. It can also be a bit of a stressful time. Anytime you're going through transition, that's a lot to manage. So we want to try to help you and support you in that. And today we're going to focus on, like I said, making a great first impression. We're going to do a lot of examples that have to do with joining for an interview, usually for a job interview. And we're going to talk about both what that looks like if you're joining on Zoom or in a virtual platform, and then also, which things to think about if you're actually going in person for an interview. Because right now it seems like pretty split. A lot of people are doing both. And sometimes in your interview process, you'll even do both at the same job. You might start out with Zoom and then switch to an in-person. So it's good to know the tips for both. And then we'll also touch on networking. So some of you might already have employment lined up, or maybe you're doing another term of service, but it's also helpful to think about these things in terms of meeting new people, making professional contacts, and growing your professional network. So hopefully there's something that is relevant for everyone today. Okay, Dana, anything I need to know in the chat before we jump in?
Nope, we still just got folks introducing themselves, so we're good to go.
Fantastic. Yep, keep that going. This is how it'll work, is I'll pause every so often and check in with Dana. So don't hesitate if you do have a question that comes up as you think of it, you're welcome to put it into the chat as we go, and we'll pause and jump in. So you might notice, especially if you've been on any of our workshops before, that I'm looking a little bit different right now. This is not how you might have expected to see your presenter showing up, but we thought it would be fun to do an interactive sort of like an I Spy, or like pick out things that you see that you feel like are not the best professional first impression, using this limited space we have of how to show up on a Zoom. So we're pretending that, let's say that I'm getting ready for a Zoom job interview, and this is what I've chosen to do. This is how I'm going to join this session. I'd love to know from you all what you notice as things that you would change about it. Feel free, you won't hurt my feelings. I am purposely being a what not to do situation. So I think, Betsy, maybe you can be the one to read out to me what we've got in the background, and I'm going to start to correct some of these things as they go so we can see.
Sure. So someone has indicated you have a rather distracting background, although someone did love your decorations, even though it's distracting. Yes, a lot of distracting, the skeleton in particular, perhaps. You're wearing a hat.
Okay, let's slow down there. I'm going to first change. I'll mention that, I don't use virtual backgrounds that often, but there have been a few times when I've used them. And sometimes if the situation was maybe not a job interview, but it was like a fun networking thing locally, I might choose something fun that talks about one of my interests. So I have learned that you can upload your own photos to use as a virtual background. This is a photo I took kayaking in the area. So if I was just doing something to like meet people and it was related, I still might use a virtual background that would allow me to network in that way. I've also seen people who do use like a professional looking background, like the one I have here, but yeah, most of the time, if you can, we would advise against a virtual background. All right, so that and a hat. Yes, hats are not great for that. And they can also put shadow on your face, which is not great. What else?
We've got a couple of folks flagging your dress. Doesn't look professional. You appear to be at a, casual clothes or sporting event or something like that.
Sorry, I'm not getting naked. I'm just saying. So I purposely put on this shirt over because it's hard to even see, but this has got stripes. And one thing that I learned back when I was doing some video work is that especially narrow stripes or tight patterns are things that show up on video as very distracting. They can create wavy lines. They can be really hard on the eyes. So you don't want anything with, I mean, even if it's not casual, you want to stay away from things with tight lines like that. And instead, even if you have, this is just a regular t-shirt, but it's a nice solid color. And I've got a nice scarf that I could put on as an alternative to kind of dress it up. So there we go. All right. What now?
Someone believes your earrings are a bit distracting, but they will note that they are cute and they want to know where you got them.
Thank you. These were a gift from my family. So I think they got them at an artist shop in Virginia. And not only are they distracting with the light, but I will admit that they are also really heavy. So they're very distracting to me as well. So I not usually wear those. I have a couple of pairs of earrings that I like to wear because these are big. So they're still big and they dangle, but they don't reflect light at least. And then I have these other ones that I like. So I usually wear these instead. Because I have short hair, so I love earrings. Having statement earrings, having earrings that are part of my personality is important to me. And that's always the balance of figuring out, okay, what's something I wear that sort of shows a bit of my personality, my identity, but isn't going to be a distraction for myself or for just the nature of, maybe you've got light on you and it's reflecting.
Great. So someone noted your screen frame.
Yes.
You were within a frame, looks like the Pride and Trans Pride flag.
Yeah, so I
But
actually
someone really likes it. Someone does like it.
Yeah, so this is a great example of, so I do actually identify as queer, but I would have to make a choice in that moment. Maybe if it's Pride Month and I've decided that this is what I'm wearing up for all of Pride, I might choose to keep that up during a job interview. But for the most part, there are things about your identity that you want to have control over when you disclose that information to a potential employer or to a professional contact. So your very first time meeting them might not be the time that you want to do that. And you just want to make sure you're doing that intentionally. It's not like, oh, I had that on for the last meeting that was like a Pride planning meeting. And now suddenly I'm going to this job interview and I didn't realize it was still up. So just making sure that you're being intentional about it. And the same thing can apply if you've got maybe a poster on the wall that speaks to something that is in one of your protected identity classes, like that has to do with your religion or your political beliefs or whether you have children or not, if you're married or not. There's things that are often in the background or that you might have on your person and maybe have a photo right behind you, that keeping that in mind when you go into a Zoom situation for professional networking or interviewing, again, just make sure this is information you want to be disclosing at that time, because you don't have to. Okay. Any other things that we can point out? We've got room to improve. We're getting better, but we've got room to improve yet.
I agree. Looking for those in the chat. I can give a hint if needed, but take a look, see if you see anything else. Oh, somebody says, what about the lighting?
Yeah, so right now I've got the window at my back and I live in Arizona, so it's quite sunny. So this is not how I normally sit at my desk. I usually sit this direction so that I can have the lighting on my face coming from the window. And see how much better that is? Like you can actually see my face, I'm not backlit, and just such a simple thing of just changing the direction that you're facing can make a huge difference in how you show up on camera.
And someone pointed out just general background, right? You don't have a closet behind you, you have some beautiful art on the wall.
Yeah, absolutely. Anything else? You don't always know what I have to play with here either, so. All right, I'm going to give you a hint because you might not know that I have this option. So right now I am using my built-in laptop camera, and that can get a little tricky because most laptop cameras come with a wide view, so it's hard to kind of control how much you see in the background. And it also can be hard because you might want to be able to see the screen. So like trying to get the angle correct. A lot of times people have their laptop back like this, kind of further back, and that ends up seeing lots of ceiling fans instead of seeing your person. So instead, if you have the option, you can use an external camera. And external cameras are actually not that expensive these days. So I think mine was maybe $20. Wait for it, plug it in. Okay, here we go. We are working with gas now. So that is what it looks like to switch from a built-in camera to an external camera. So you can see this is a now high definition camera. It allows for even better quality of the video, and it just narrows the amount that's in the screen because it's not a wide angle. And so that's so much nicer when you're looking to have a bit of more control. Looks like someone was pointing out the audio. Yeah, so it automatically picked up the audio from the camera instead of the built-in audio from my laptop. So that's another advantage of working with something like an external camera, is you can automatically get better audio. If you don't have that option, you can work on getting better audio by using a headset, or using, if you've got earbuds or things, sometimes, you want to test that and practice just even on a regular call with a family or friend, but seeing which thing comes across the best. Okay, I've also got this lamp behind me. I was going to experiment with just using the light from the lamp to backlight myself, but that didn't work very well. So I would normally move this. So
I would say overall they did really well.
yeah, I think that's great. There's a few more things that we can think about when you're controlling for your space, but I think that shows you just, how much improvement you can take without necessarily, the external camera you can spend a little bit of money on. Like I said, most of them you can get something that's already high quality with only about $20 off of any major online retailer. And that'll make enough of a difference to make it worth it for the most part. Betsy, anything else you would add, or anything we saw in the chat?
Nope, I think that covers it. You look great.
Thank you.
You're hired.
That's the easy part, right? Yeah, so you'll want to look around at what you have available if you've got especially an online networking or an online interview situation. Just a few key things to think about. Wearing solids as your main color is usually good. It's nice to have a color that contrasts with your backdrop. So if you're going to be on a white wall, just not wearing white or cream, it's good to actually have a solid color to allow for that contrast. If you are feeling comfortable wearing makeup, I do recommend wearing a little bit of makeup. I'm not really wearing makeup right now, but that can just help you be a little bit easier to see and help you articulate. My sister is actually a professional costumer. She works for costumes on Broadway in the theater. And so I think from an early age, she was passionate about costumes since she was 4 years old. And it's given me an interesting perspective on thinking about how do we dress? How do we show up to things? And I know a lot of times it's like, well, I don't want to be told what to wear, or they should, I should be able to just feel comfortable wearing whatever I want. And to some extent, I agree with that. And it's certainly important to be comfortable and to feel confident in your own authenticity and showing up how you want. But within that spectrum, I think it's thinking about this particular occasion and how to use your look and your fashion and any tools you have from physical appearance to be able to make a good impression, and not just like fitting into someone else's idea of what a good impression is, but really thinking about how can you convey yourself in a way that conveys certain qualities, certain strengths, gives you confidence. So it's really a bigger picture of how do you show up confident? How do you show up as yourself, and what you would like to see yourself looking like in that role, in that sector?
And this can change. So for example, when I've gone to community networking events, last night I was at a local business mixer, and I was thinking about, for instance, what earrings to wear, specifically thinking, okay, these are local business owners. It would be fun if I could wear some earrings that I bought locally from a local business, from a local artist. And that gives me something to start a conversation about. And sometimes if I'm going to a big event and I know I'm going to be meeting a lot of people, let's say it's a conference or a speed networking event, then part of what I'm thinking about is, how do I be memorable? How do I stand out? So I have these glitter sneakers, high top sneakers. They help. One thing that helps is that they are comfortable, so I can wear them all day for a conference, but they're also memorable. So one thing I've found is that at something like a big conference, you'll meet someone and maybe you have a great moment with them. You talk to them about how you're passionate about public health, maybe, and you're looking for a job. And perhaps later in the day, they meet someone who's looking to hire someone in public health. Well, it's really hard for people to remember everyone's name and to really track you down. But if you have something memorable in your appearance, like a statement necklace or a statement pair of shoes, or just wearing a bright color or something like that, it becomes easier for them to point you out. Even if they can't remember your name, it's like, oh, it's that person over there. I remember she was the one wearing the glitter sneakers. So it can actually work to your advantage to have something that's easy for people to recall, that's memorable, that makes you unique, and that can help make those opportunities open up for you. Another kind of over the top thing that I did was a lot of these things like AmeriCorps, they'll give you buttons, like I have my AmeriCorps alums button. I also am someone who doesn't like touching people, so I have a not a hugger patch because we work in the human services industry and everyone seems to be a hugger other than me. I have my she, I don't know if you can tell this, she, her, hers pronouns pin. So I actually created myself like a little pieces of flair necklace for my name badge, and it had like all my little pieces of flair. And so that's, it's a bit much, but it was a conversation starter and it helped people say, oh my gosh, what do you have on there? And then I could explain quickly, like, oh, well, I'm an AmeriCorps alum and currently I'm with Do Good, Be Good. And, this is a little bit about me and I have a podcast. So that's something that you just, again, is sort of costuming, it's like thinking about how can I use props or parts of my outfit to convey something useful in that moment, or just give people a way to start a conversation, especially when we're talking about networking. It can be really awkward. We're all coming back to going into in-person events, and I have found that these are some of the most awkward times that I have had. Everyone's like forgotten how to introduce themselves. People are standing around on their phones, not really sure what to do. So if you feel the courage to be the one to be out there with something a little bit eye-catching, something that's going to give people an excuse to say, hey, what are you wearing, or what is that? That can break the ice and do a lot of legwork for you. Going back to interviews for a second, just one other wearing and kind of merging into another tip is thinking about things that are distracting. So this is a noisy and sparkly bracelet or necklace. And what I have found a lot of times is that you may not even realize, like if you're someone who likes to wear bracelets, maybe you've got bangles, maybe you just have pockets and you've kept things in your pockets like a change, you cannot realize that you have something that makes noise. So that's the sound of this on the desk. And a lot of times those are the things that we ourselves become immune to. Just don't even realize you're doing it, but it can be incredibly distracting. And this counts for in-person as well. So not just thinking about how do I look, but also thinking, is there anything that I'm wearing or that I have with me that's going to be something I might distract myself with? A common one we see a lot is people having a clicky pen and clicking their pen all the time, or having something that they fiddle with. So if you know that you're someone who needs to fidget, one thing that I've used in the past is actual string, being allowed to fidget with string because it does not make noise. You could keep it hidden. You could have something that you could fidget with that is not going to be audibly distracting. The other thing you'll want to think about, particularly on Zoom or in a virtual setting, because you can control your environment a little bit better, is do you have anything that is distracting that's in front of you? We've spent a lot of time talking about what's behind you and giving yourself the best, professional look behind you. But once you're actually in the meeting and on the Zoom, you're going to be looking forward. So thinking about, what am I looking at? As you saw when I was setting everything up, I have a window right in front of me. So it's definitely been distracting at times because I have a bird feeder right outside my window. And oh my gosh, all those jokes about how when you get over 30, you suddenly know all the birds on your bird feeder. I don't know if anyone else has seen that meme, but that's like how you know you're getting old, is you suddenly like care about what birds are on your bird feeder. That is totally me now. And so I have to be careful that if I'm leading a session, I've invested in some blinds so that I can close the blinds and give myself a distraction-free environment. Because otherwise I'm always like, oh my God, it's a Stellar Jay. Have you seen the Stellar Jay? And that can be really distracting. Any questions coming in, Betsy, that I need to know about, or any comments?
No, nothing to pull out.
Okay, great. So we've covered a bit of what to wear, about what not to wear. If you have any specific questions, anything you've run into, would be happy to take those. Like I said, this is going to vary. Of course, you'll want your own personal style, your own thoughts about what you're comfortable in. Make sure you try on what you're going to wear fully, all the way down to your shoes, before you wear it, because you might realize that, you've got a thread loose, something has happened, this outfit doesn't work the way it used to work, and you need to fix it beforehand. So especially those of us who don't leave our houses as much as we used to, there might be an outfit that you need to revisit before you use it for a special occasion. And then you'll also want to think about those distractions. So distractions that are on your person, in your pockets, and then also ahead of you if you're doing it on Zoom. Now, we also want to think about, what are you going to need, particularly during an interview? Let's use that setting because that's going to be the most critical in terms of getting what you need. So I would highly recommend having water at the ready. Be careful about how much caffeine you consume ahead of time. I remember actually, I wasn't a coffee drinker until I went to graduate school. And suddenly in graduate school, I decided I needed to start drinking coffee in my life. And so the very first day I had my very first, probably mocha, because I didn't even like the taste of coffee back then. I had some sort of mocha latte thing. And I had a presentation at work later that day. I was just like bouncing off the walls, and I was talking so fast, and they were like, we're worried about you. What is going on? I was like, I'm so sorry. I just started drinking coffee this week. And they were like, it's okay. It's okay. We understand. Just breathe. So you'll want to, don't add anything new in terms of trying a new caffeinated drink the day of. Don't try some new special tea that's going to amp you up or make you need to run to the restroom 20 times. Just try to stick to something that works for you. Have a good breakfast, have a good simple water. What I do is that I like to have a glass if I'm on a workshop or webinar. What I've noticed in the past is that, I used to be a big water bottle drinker. And it's nice to have like a branded water bottle if you want to talk about your AmeriCorps service. But especially for this style of bottle that's got this big open mouth, I've realized that, just watch for a second. I don't know about you, but to me that looks awkward. It's like I have to tip my head all the way back, and I don't like the way that looks. Unfortunately, I've had to deal with a lot of having myself recorded and watching the recording. So over time, I was like, I don't like that. So I no longer drink out of large water bottles in interviews or especially if I'm on camera. So instead I have a water, but one thing you'll have to think about is setting up your space ahead of time. You don't want anything that's going to knock over. So I'm lucky that I have an L desk set up here so I can put my water as far from my laptop as possible. In case I accidentally knock it over, it's not going to spill on top of my laptop and drown everything and ruin our lives. So this might seem like simple things, and yet this is all about giving you the space to be fully present and confident when you get into that interview situation or when you get into that important meeting. You don't want to be wondering about, oh, I'm thirsty, I gotta hop off and go grab water, or about knocking things over. You just really want to get comfortable in your space and know you have what you need. Another option would be a water bottle with a lid and a straw. It can be really helpful for not knocking things over and having something, that it's easy to drink out of. Okay, any other questions on anything I covered? Any tips coming in? Okay, great. And if you have your own tips, things that have worked for you, feel free to share those as well. It's great to learn from one another. I live in Arizona. It's super dry here. We have only seen rain once in months. And so I also have an entire pitcher of water at the ready to be able to refill my water as I go. They definitely want to have that ready. If you do realize in the middle of a meeting, an important meeting where you're on camera, you have everything set up the way you want it, you've got things dialed in, the lighting's right, and then maybe the dog starts barking and you need to put the dog out, or you just really need to use the restroom, or someone rings the doorbell. That has happened to me. I was actually in the middle of a 5-minute grant presentation for a place that I volunteer, and I was on the clock, I was being timed, I had 5 minutes, I had to give our pitch for why we should get this funding, and I couldn't, the internet went down at my house 30 minutes before the presentation. So I raced over to the nonprofit's offices so that I could do it from there. I get there, I'm in the lobby, it's like a nice setting, I'm all set up, I'm like, whew, crisis averted. And then right as I start talking, as soon as the timer starts, someone starts pounding on the door of the nonprofit. And there's no one else there to open the door. And I'm like, it's a glass door. If the person could see me, they could see that I was just completely ignoring them as I'm like, I'm just going to pretend that everything's fine. And I'm going to talk on this presentation. And then on top of that, it turned out they were an exterminator coming to do a treatment on the building. So I'm trying to keep my composure, talk about how we deserve this funding. And they came back from their truck with this wand with chemicals and they started spraying it right on the other side of the door from where I was sitting. And I was like, oh my gosh, the things we do for the nonprofits we care about, I'm probably poisoned for life now. So things can happen that are unexpected. And if you are not on a 5-minute timer clock, if you're in a normal situation, it's perfectly acceptable to say, would you excuse me for just a moment? I need to XYZ, put my dog out, let the person at the door know that I'm not coming, whatever it is. If you're in that situation, what I would highly recommend is to go ahead and take your camera off and then mute yourself. Then you're going to come back, then you're going to put your camera back on. So they don't see you walking out, see you walking back on. So that is going to be the best way to handle that. As you notice, when I took my camera off, I have updated my settings in Zoom to have a professional headshot as my default for when I'm not on camera. So it just gives a really clean professional look. It allows you to do something polite without interfering. Okay.
Baron, I just want to lift up something from the chat. Was a note about your glasses, not your particular, but anyone's glasses, especially if they have blue light filters, or just sort of acknowledging that sometimes reflections can show up in the glasses from your screen and it can be distracting to others, or even folks can even see through the reflection other screens or windows you have up on your computer. So just be mindful of that.
Fantastic. Yeah, and Dana and Betsy both are glasses wearers, so they have dealt with this in many situations and can speak to that. Fantastic. One other thing in terms of what you might need and prepare for is, if you are going to an interview, highly recommend bringing a little notebook with you. You could bring a whole portfolio, or your resume printed out within a nice binder. There's certainly more sophisticated things that, if you feel like that job warrants it, would make sense. But for any interview, even if it's just for a seasonal temporary position, I would at least recommend bringing a little notebook and a pen and be ready to take notes. A few things you'll want to take note of: take notes of the names of your interviewers. It is still best practice to send a thank you note afterwards. You can send a thank you email, or you can mail a thank you note. These days, I find that both are pretty much equivalent. There is some magic to a handwritten mailed thank you note. However, there are so many people who are working remotely or working hybrid that sometimes you go through the effort of mailing a thank you note to their office, and they don't even go into the office frequently enough to receive it by the time you wanted them to, by the time maybe they're making a decision. So yes, there is some magic to that handwritten thank you note, sending that afterwards in the mail, but I would either do both of sending an email and a handwritten note, or just send an email, unless you know for sure that they're definitely going to be in their offices getting the mail. And I found that a lot of times with an interview or with an important meeting, you're going to be meeting with multiple people. And I remember my first job interview after AmeriCorps, it was for a job at a local government. I was working in their human services department. I got the job. But in the interview, I wasn't really expecting the fact that it ended up being a panel interview. And we had at least 5 people who were part of that panel. So I was really caught off guard. I knew the name of the person who was the supervisor and would be the hiring person, but I had no idea who these other 4 people were. And I was so nervous that I really blacked out when they all said their names. I couldn't remember at all. And in fact, I got the job, and later I got introduced to people I'd be working with. And I remember meeting my boss's boss, and she was like, "Oh yeah, we've already met. I was in your interview." I'm like, really? Because that was all a blur. I did not remember at all. I was just so anxious. So having a notebook, being able to try to take the attention of writing down each person's name, maybe making a few notes to yourself when they ask you a question. Every type of company, sector, business is different in the way that they approach the hiring process. So you will find vast differences if you end up going to interviews with like a small nonprofit versus a large federal government office versus a entrepreneurial startup. They're going to be so different in their approach to interviewing that there isn't really a one size fits all way of preparing in terms of what to expect. So there are some general rules of thumb in terms of research ahead of time, understand a bit about the position and the company, prepare yourself. We're going to give you some tips on that in a minute. But just know that once you know a bit more about where you're applying, what type of interview this is, if it's in person or phone or virtual panel, etc., then you're going to be able to get some specific tips and advice for that situation. And at the end of today's session, we will be sharing out a link So if you do have an interview coming up, we give you the option to sign up for mock interview practice with us. We'll also send that out when we send out the recording. So that's a really great opportunity. If you know you're going to have an interview coming up, or even a very important meeting that you'd like our advice on, then we can help you do that one-on-one. Okay, anything new that has come in that I need to address?
Nope.
Okay, great. Betsy, would you mind popping on real quick here on screen? I wanted to talk about a couple of things that come up in interviews. And I know that, Betsy, you have been a hiring manager many times. You've also been through the process as an interviewee. And I wanted to talk about red flags and the red flags that we see come up in people we interview. And if you're the one being interviewed, what are the red flags that you would spot from a potential employer? So keep in mind that this is that two-way street. So they're looking at you, but you're also looking at them, and you can learn a lot from being observant during this interview stage about whether this is a place that you're going to enjoy being part of. So Betsy, what are some things that come to mind for you of red flags?
Well, from the hiring manager perspective, I think that it can be difficult to gauge how long you should respond to questions. But I do think someone who's sort of not able to cut themselves off or continues to ramble, or someone who gives one-word answers, maybe not a huge red flag, but definitely something that makes it difficult for us to get a sense of the candidate and whether or not we want to move forward. So I think it's really helpful to practice sort of your response time, aim for that middle, sort of give yourself a cutoff. And again, practice. Right? If you're practicing responses to some really common questions, you'll feel more prepared. But it is really difficult to get a feel for a candidate if they say nothing or if they don't stop talking. And so that's, also a little bit of an indication of how might this person be as a colleague? And is this going to be helpful? So that's one thing I always advise people, is to be mindful of your response length in an interview.
Yeah, and that can be hard depending on how they structure the interview.
Absolutely.
Interviewer who is using best practices and is more skilled at this, they should start off by welcoming you, helping you feel comfortable by giving you some rapport building questions like, did you have any trouble finding the place? Did you, how's the weather outside? Really just softball, making you feel comfortable kinds of rapport questions. And if you are ever in the place of being the interviewer, take this advice as well of, we're not trying to intimidate people and put them in the most harsh situation and seeing how they react. This is not a reality television show. We're not trying to set them up to fail. So ideally they do have those comfort building questions, and then they should go into what we would call personal reflective questions. And this is what we often see of things like, tell me about yourself would be the most broad one, or more specific things like, what are a couple of your key strengths, or where do you see yourself in 5 years? Anything that's having you reflect on yourself, sort of a broad way. So have you seen any red flags come up within those kind of reflective questions, Betsy?
I think that if the candidate also sort of, if someone really doesn't seem well informed for the organization where you're interviewing, so reflection can be sort of your current position, past positions, but yet I really appreciate tying in with an acknowledgement of what the job is, what the position requires, what kind of work that we do. And so if there's little or no research, even if it's just browsing a website, if there's little or no research, that really comes through. And I do think that's a bit of a flag that there's not an effort to sort of connect it to the job you're hiring.
Yeah, absolutely. And a good example of that is they'll usually ask you something like, what drew you to this position? Or why do you want this job? And if you're saying, well, I really need money, or, or I'm not actually sure, I think it was one of the 10 that LinkedIn recommended for me, and you can't even remember what the position was. I've certainly been on the other end of that, where people submitted cover letters with the wrong company name or the wrong position name. It was clear they had just cut and pasted and forgot to cut and paste correctly. So that is a major turnoff, and you're not going to be attracted to someone who does that. I think likewise, the flip side of that is, as an interviewee, if you're asking them a bit about the position and they seem very vague on what this position is going to entail, and they don't really understand what it, what the purpose of it is, or, that can be a red flag as well. That's more common with maybe a small business or a small nonprofit where they might be creating something new and it's not very well established yet. And you're just going to want to help define that. Okay, the next couple of kinds of interview questions that you can expect would be about your actual experience. So these are typically framed in one of two ways. There's what we call situational questions, which is where you'd say, imagine that you're working in this busy office and the phone is ringing and someone walks in the door at the same time, and you also have a report that's due in an hour. How would you balance those three competing priorities? So they're going to give you a situation that you might expect in that position and ask you how you might respond to it. And this is just based on the theory that people typically act in the way that they imagine they would act. So asking someone a hypothetical is a pretty good way of getting a sense of how they would actually behave in that situation. The opposite would be an experience question that goes to their past experience. So instead of saying hypothetically, how would you do this? They'd say, tell me about a time when you disagreed with your supervisor and how did you handle that? Anything that comes up for you, Betsy, when you're thinking about these ones that are specifically talking about experience, either hypothetical or past experience?
Yes, I think these are some of the most valuable ones for anyone hiring, is because in a way, these are stories, and stories are powerful, and stories help you learn. And I really, really appreciate those kinds of questions. And I always include plenty of them anytime I'm interviewing. So, again, this is an important thing to practice, right? Think of your biggest skills, then think of stories that illustrate those. I think it's helpful to have those kind of in your mind so that you can respond to this. But again, I think this is the best way to showcase who you are and what kind of employee you might be, is sharing some of these stories. And I also really have appreciated candidates who maybe share a story of how they didn't handle something as well as they wanted to, and then what they learned from it and what they would do differently. Sometimes you don't have a great story for every, tell me a time when. Sometimes you have a time where you messed up, or and I think I have really appreciated that honesty, and also hearing what they learned from it, and what they would have done differently, and how they've grown. I really think that you don't have to have that pressure on yourself. I think that honesty coupled with sort of a growth mindset, I also think makes people stand out.
Well, I'm going to put you on the spot now.
Okay.
Because I totally agree with you that some pre-work before even a networking situation, so even those of you who aren't preparing for a job interview, but you're thinking about your transition out of AmeriCorps, how do I talk about my experience in other situations? This would be a good exercise really for everyone. Think about 3 skills or strengths or qualities, things that help you stand out or make you a good fit for this particular position. And then you're going to want to reflect on what is a story, was an example that I can give that would not just tell someone that I'm detail oriented, for example, but would actually show them through this story that I am detail oriented. They can actually picture it because of the way I've explained it. So Betsy, what is one thing that you would call out as one of your strengths or skills or qualities?
I think probably being adaptable, being able to pivot quickly.
Okay, great. Adaptable. Like a very useful skill. I'm writing it on a piece of paper. Adaptable. Great. So what is a story you have of a time where you needed to be adaptable?
Well, I think that one of the silver linings of the pandemic we just all went through was that this was a skill that a lot of us, I think, probably had to develop or at least practice. And so I think that my COVID experience gives me a lot of these examples. I would probably bring up an example of in-person training, a series that I was developing that had to quickly shift to virtual, which meant an entirely new curriculum, redesign of everything, turning around quickly, learning an online platform, getting everything set, enrolling folks. So I think that's probably what I would dig into, is that, we turned that around, we made it completely virtual, it was successful, and I'd highlight some of the great things, some of the great reviews we got from that.
Was there a time in that process where you were concerned that you might not be able to make that pivot and adapt?
Absolutely. I think that, like all of us, I think that potentially can highlight another skill, which is resiliency. But I think in that time period, things were very stressful. Things were stressful on the personal for many of us, right? With families or at-risk family members or children. I think that being able, not really knowing what was going to happen or not really understanding fully what we were going through caused a lot of stress. And so there were a lot of times I thought I wouldn't have time to finish. We wouldn't have the same interests because we were pivoting, or that I wouldn't be able to learn a new technology overnight as I had to. So I think that, yeah, there was a lot of self-questioning going on there. There was a lot going on.
Right. And then at the end, once you had made that pivot, once you had been able to be that adaptable, is there anything in terms of results that you saw from doing that, or a way that you felt once it was over?
Well, I felt great for having successfully done it, but I also think it changed the way I do some of the work that I do, because we were able to engage with folks across the country, right, in different time zones. So it actually increased access to this training series we do that we hadn't thought about before. And now it seems almost crazy that we hadn't thought about doing a virtual sort of wider audience event. So I feel excited because now we have implemented that as a regular part of our programming. We reach more people, it's more accessible, folks can join without having to travel. And so I feel really excited because it changed our practice and it was successful in the best possible way.
Great. So I just wanted to demonstrate for you all that, this is what I'd like for you to do. And I'm going to give you a minute to be reflective and write some notes to yourself, but kind of stepping through what we just said with Betsy, I want you to think about a skill or quality. While if you have just completed AmeriCorps service and are getting ready to, you might want to think specifically about something you learned through your AmeriCorps service, a skill that you demonstrated in that service. And then what is a time when you were demonstrating that skill or quality? And storytelling is a really great skill to use in professional networking as well as interviewing, because when you paint the picture and tell that story, and you actually give it these human qualities, I'm asking Betsy about, did you think you could do it? Was there a time where you weren't sure if it was going to make it? That tension there, that conflict, that is what makes a story really compelling. And so it's not just telling the end of the story of, yeah, we did it and it was great, but it's painting the whole picture of like, well, when this first happened, I was very concerned. I was stressed. We wanted to help these people, but suddenly our usual ways of doing so had been erased. It's okay to actually lean in and tell the interviewer or the people in your professional network the parts that were hard and the parts that created tension and conflict, either internally or that you were actually working with people through conflict. And then take them on that whole journey of, this is the situation we were in. This is why it was hard. This is how we worked through it. And this is what I learned from it, or how I was able to achieve results based on that. And that's something that for every time that you're either interviewed for a job or for media, other things, you'll want to have a few of those in your back pocket, because you don't know what they're going to ask you. But if you've done some pre-work, and you've got not just one story and one skill, but if you do this for 3 different ones, then that puts all of that really fresh in your mind, and it allows you to draw up those stories and serve them out on a silver platter to whatever questions you might get asked where they feel like they could be relevant. And that's really important, because you will be nervous, you will feel on the spot, And if you haven't done that pre-work and had the time to reflect on it, sometimes the first thing that comes into your mind might be a story that is either too personal and you didn't want to tell it, or it's just not as relevant, or maybe it highlights a skill, but it's not a skill that's necessary in this job. So you just really want to give that yourself that best preparation of doing those. So we're going to be quiet for a minute. I'm going to let you try to jot down 3 skills or qualities or strengths, and then start to think about what is an example that I could do. If you only get to 1 right now, that's all right, but we're going to be quiet for a little bit and let you write that down for yourself. We got a couple questions in the chat. 1 or 2 is definitely relative to what we've asked you to do. So let me just point that out. One of the questions was about sort of how much depth to go into, how much to structure your answer. And some of that is going to depend. Unfortunately, a lot of this depends. I know Betsy had talked about trying to find that balance between being concise, but also we want you to go into enough detail that you're memorable, that they can really picture what it is you're telling them. So that's the balance you have to strike, is you don't want to go on for 10 minutes and leave people thinking, oh my gosh, when is she going to finish the story? But you also do want to give enough detail, because one thing as an interviewer that I have noticed is we often stack a bunch of interviews right after each other. And because of that, you can literally not remember people. You're interviewing maybe 7 or 8 people for a job, and the very first one you're like, oh my gosh, I think they said they were organized. But if you can tie that skill to an actual story and give enough detail that they're like, oh, they were the ones who were in charge of, the county fair for their city, for their area, and had to keep track of all the contestants and keep everybody's entries straightened out, then that's going to be so much easier for them when they're reviewing their candidates. We have also seen a question about what are good weaknesses. I definitely agree with Betsy that as an interviewer, I try not to ask that question about what is your greatest weakness, or it's definitely a fraught question and a lot of people struggle with it. And I do think it can be seen as a gotcha, and I don't blame people for that. I have been asked that question in interviews. I remember that one time I said that my weakness was mental toughness. And I explained that I was training to become a rugby referee, and that in the rugby game, I was trying to keep track of time and watch for penalties, but at the same time, I had a lot of people yelling at me, and there were people yelling in the game, and trying to not let that affect me and let me do my job while people are yelling at me and people are hitting each other in front of me. And I think that was kind of a useful one, because people are so distracted by the story and like, wait, you're doing what? People are hitting each other. And so I feel like they lost track of what their question was. And it was sort of a good sideways one, but I'm not even sure if that was a great answer. Betsy, what do you think about that?
It's so difficult. So I don't know, maybe this is a red flag for you for this, for the, where you're interviewing. Because I think as someone who hires people, I just don't think that's necessarily even valuable. But I think my recommendation is always sort of reframing that we all have areas we want to improve in, that we're growing in, that we're learning in. And so I would reframe it and say that. And I have done that myself when I'm asked that question. There are plenty of things I'd like to learn more about, where I want to be pushed and challenged. And so I would reframe it, and then just hope there are other good questions in the interview, because I just don't, it's an impossible question to answer correctly. I think.
Yeah. I would agree that the key for a weakness question would be that it shows self-awareness, but it also shows a willingness to grow and learn. So people are looking for, what is something that you've identified that you need to improve upon, and how are you actually going to improve upon that, or what actions have you already taken? So I know that's been a pet peeve of mine when I've hired people in the past, is if they identify, like, right out of college, I went on this trip. I remember someone writing an essay for AmeriCorps actually saying, I went on a spring break trip to another country and I realized that people were poor in other countries and that they needed our help. And so that's why I'm joining AmeriCorps like 8 years later. And I thought, well, you had 8 years between that trip and now, and I don't see anything else in your application about having ever volunteered anywhere or taking any classes about poverty, learning, educating yourself on what affects poverty around the world. So, sometimes it's like, well, if you have that insight, but you're not actually working on it, then that can be a red flag. Okay. At the end of today, I'll just give you the heads up. We got a little more time to share a few more tips with you, but then we're going to allow some time at the end to give you a chance to get into breakout rooms with one another and share one of these that we just demonstrated. So sharing one of the things you've learned and one story that you have to give you that practice. So we'll warn you before that happens. If there's anyone who feels like they can't participate in that, that's okay. That's why we left it for the end. But just a heads up that you will get a chance to share in a group if you would like to. So before we do that, one other question that I think helps you to reflect on your time in AmeriCorps and maybe will generate some insights that you could share as you're making that first impression is, what is something that you thought you knew before you did AmeriCorps that you think about differently now? Something that you believed before that you think about differently now. Just let you reflect on that for a second. And I'm curious in the chat, let me know if there's something that jumps to mind for you that you'd be willing to share. We have a big group today, so if anyone did have one, I mean, this is a big question, so certainly I understand if you need a little time to think about it.
Can you repeat it just one more time? I understood it, but I just got to hear it one more time.
Yeah, absolutely. So what is something that you thought you knew before your AmeriCorps service that you think about differently now? What I find is that, I've done some storytelling competitions and some speaking competitions, and these are ways to start to think about how we transform, how we come to new understandings, new beliefs, how our life experiences affect us and make us who we are. And that's often a very rich source for being able to translate your experience in AmeriCorps to other people and to realize, what you've really learned through that. I'll give my own example. I mean, I think broadly, I used to just sort of always think that charity and people, quote unquote, doing good for others It's just always good. It wasn't problematic. There weren't questions about it. I just sort of assumed it was always good. I think now that I've worked in this space, and certainly this started as an AmeriCorps member when I served, I started realizing how complicated it is to help people and to make sure that you're actually being helpful and that you're helping in a way that empowers others or that matches what they want for themselves. So just realizing the greater nuances, the greater complexities of what it means to be helpful. I see someone was saying, I thought my role was going to be different than it was. Found out soon that I was doing more desk job than hands-on. And you might reflect further on that, what did that teach you about what type of work you want to do? For some people, if you ended up doing more desk job than hands-on, some people realize that's what you want to do, Other people, it's like, wow, until I realized how disappointed I was that I didn't get to be hands-on, that really enhanced my realization that that's where I love to be. I love to actually be in it, be helping people in a really direct way. That can be a really important insight as you look at your next career path. I see here, I was under the impression that everyone understood what diversity was until now. Yeah, great. And then figuring out how does that affect you if people have different views of that? Seeing that I didn't know that environmental nonprofits were just supported and funded by the ones causing the issues. Yeah. And what does that create in terms of a system? If there's questions in terms of how is the system sustaining itself, the sources of funding are coming from people who maybe are polluting the environment, things like that. Great. So as you can see, it's a big, meaty question, and reflecting on that question can really help you, if not prepare to tell a story in an interview or talk about your experience, can at least prepare you to reflect on how much you're learning, what has changed in your views and your worldview and your impression of things since serving. Okay. I want to touch real quick on legal questions. We mentioned these earlier a little bit, but just want to remind you or educate you if you're not aware that there are things you're not allowed to be asked about in an interview. And this is why I was mentioning, being careful about what's in the background. If you have pictures of your kids, you're not allowed to be asked if you are married and have kids, or you're not allowed to be asked about your health status. You can't be asked about your religion or your nationality. So there are certain things that are called protected classes, and there's national, federal ones, and then some jurisdictions have additional ones. So for instance, in the town that I live in, your sexual identity, gender identity are additional protected classes, even though they're not at a federal level. So it's important to know your rights and know what you're comfortable talking about. Because something is an illegal question, it doesn't mean that you can't volunteer that information. I'd say probably every interview I've ever been in, people have sometimes told us information that we were not allowed to ask about. They might have told us about a health condition or about their children or about their religious background. So that's an important distinction. There's things that the employer is not allowed to ask you, and it is up to you to decide if you want to volunteer that information. And sometimes you do, because it might be so important to you and so important to your identity and how you operate day to day that you want it out there in front, and you want to make sure that this is a place that knows that, having a flexible schedule so that you can pick up your kids is the reason why you're looking at these particular jobs. And it's all about recognizing both what your rights are, but then also what's important to you, and how do you be intentional about what you choose to disclose and when. You certainly don't need to choose to disclose things in the first interview. For most hiring processes, there's going to be more than one step. They might do a first pre-interview, and then there might be a more in-depth interview later. For bigger jobs, sometimes you're actually brought in to tour the building and meet other people that work there. You might have to do a presentation. There's all kinds of different ways that people go through a hiring process. But for most places, you're going to have at least 2 steps. So you can always choose to wait and not disclose something until a further round of the hiring process. If it's a larger employer, you also can wait and contact their human resources department to ask about maybe, for instance, telework policies, if that's important to you, rather than asking the person who's in the interview. For something really small, like a small nonprofit, if they don't have their own HR, or a small business, you may need to ask the hiring manager some of your more logistical questions about how the company works. A couple things for networking events specifically, or opportunities to make a good first impression when you're at a professional event. So this is a basic logistical thing, but surprisingly, it's something people get wrong a lot, might be confusing. If you get a name tag, I have my own magnetic name tag for Do Good, Be Good. You can also, have one that you write yourself. Demonstrate that. If you have to write your own name tag, I highly recommend using your first name, using up as much space as possible so that it is clearly legible on your name tag. You may want to use your pronouns on a name tag, or your organization that you're representing. Use up the space, try to make the most of it. And then with your name tag, you're going to want to put it on your right side. So I think we might be switched here on the screen, so let me know if that's confusing. But you want it to be on your right side. And the reason for this is that we generally shake hands with our right hand, and then someone's going to shake your hand, their eyes is going to follow you all the way up, and they're going to then be drawn directly to your name tag. If you have a business card, you'll want to have those at the ready. I like to have a little pouch that I keep them in. If it's at a conference, you can stick them in your name tag and have them at the ready. If you order your own business cards, I've got mine with my photo on the back, which I find is particularly helpful for conferences because you meet so many different people, you don't remember who you met. So having your photo is a good cheat code for people remembering you. And when you do introduce yourself, it's good, again, to be memorable. So I recommend saying something like, hi, I'm with Do Good, Be Good. We are, a new company in this space, and I'm from the cold part of Arizona, and my name is Sharon. 2 things I did there. I included a fun fact, the cold part of Arizona. That usually gets people's attention and they ask questions about that. And then I often try to end with my name rather than starting with it, because I've found that people will remember your name if it's the last thing that you say. And it's a lot less awkward for them to say, where do you work again? Rather than what is your name? So it's a very picky thing, but okay. So I'm going to review real quick what we have happening next, and then we're going to have a chance to have that practice if you are able to stick around for that. And I'll give you a sense of what happens after today. So we are recording today. Dana is going to be sending out the recording of today's session along with additional resources. In those additional resources, we're also going to have some advice about how to put AmeriCorps on your resume. We're going to have some information about LinkedIn, some information about other things to do to prepare for an interview, to make sure that you're ready. We've got checklists of what to do on the day of, things like that. So a lot of great resources if that's in your next steps. And then, like I said, we'll also have a link to sign up for mock interview practice if you have an interview coming up or a big opportunity coming up where you want to make a big first impression. So that will all come out, and we typically will either send that out Friday or early next week, like Monday of next week. So be on the lookout for that. It will come from support@dogoodbegood.us. Today's session was sponsored by America Learns, so thank you to them. They support the AmeriCorps network. And then for the rest of today's session, we are going to go into those breakouts to let you share one of your strengths and a story that you have. When you go into the breakout room, you'll be in there with just a couple of other people. And so we encourage you to also introduce yourself, give your name. And if you're comfortable coming on camera, that would be ideal. You can also use this as a time to practice getting your space set up or feeling comfortable on camera. And just a chance to meet a few other people in the AmeriCorps space. So I know we have some staff on. You can join us if you'd like, or if you want to hop off, you're welcome to. And then we'll get started with that. Oh, and yes, thank you, Dana, for the reminder. We also have a link to the evaluation for today. So if you would go ahead, the link is in the chat. Click on that link. We will also send that out in the follow-up email.